The Magnolia Stand. Welcome to today's story. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting stories. Let's dive in. The Magnolia Caffe was nestled in the heart of the city, just far enough away from the main streets that it felt like a hidden gem. It wasn't a place that advertised itself much, yet its reputation had grown among those who sought an exclusive, quiet space. People came here to escape the noise of urban life, to sip perfectly brewed coffee, and to indulge in small luxuries like freshly baked pastries served on delicate china plates. Emily Davis had heard about the cafe many times from colleagues who raved about its charm, but her schedule had never allowed for a visit until today. For once, her calendar was miraculously clear. No last-minute meetings, no calls to clients, no court dates looming on the horizon. It was a gift of time she hadn't had in months. As she walked down the narrow cobblestone street that led to the cafe, she smiled to herself, feeling a rare sense of lightness. Today would be her day, a chance to relax with a book she'd been meaning to finish for weeks. The bell above the cafe door tinkled softly as she entered, a sound that seemed to signal the start of something calm and pleasant. Emily paused just inside the door, taking in the atmosphere. The Magnolia Café was exactly as she had imagined, elegant, with a hint of nostalgia. The walls were a soft sage green, adorned with framed botanical prints that gave the space a refined but homey feel. Soft light streamed in from large bay windows, casting warm patches of sun on the wooden floors. In the background, quiet jazz played, barely audible over the murmur of voices and the clinking of porcelain cups. Emily felt a sense of calm settle over her as she stepped further into the room. She had dressed simply but neatly, wearing a crisp white blouse tucked into tailored black slacks. Her hair, a halo of tight curls, was pulled back into a bun, and she carried with her only a small leather handbag and the book she had been waiting to dive into. She approached the counter, her eyes scanning the chalkboard menu written in flowing script. "One Americano, please," she said, offering a polite smile to the barista. The young man behind the counter nodded, returning her smile, though it seemed slightly strained. Emily noticed a brief flicker of something in his eyes, hesitation, maybe even discomfort, but she brushed it off. After all, this was her time. She wasn't here to analyze every interaction, and perhaps she was reading too much into it. As she waited for her drink, she took a moment to look around. The cafe was nearly full, but the patrons were spread out across the space, each absorbed in their own world. A few businessmen in suits sat near the back, laptops open in front of them, likely typing out emails or working on presentations. A couple sat near the window, the woman flipping through a magazine while her companion scrolled through his phone. Nearby, an older woman in a wide-brimmed hat stirred sugar into her tea, her gaze lingering on Emily for just a second too long. Emily was used to this, the feeling of standing out. The Magnolia Café's clientele was predominantly white, and though she had no reason to feel unwelcome, the subtle glances made it clear that she wasn't exactly part of the typical crowd. But this was nothing new to her. As a black woman working in predominantly white spaces, Emily had long ago learned how to carry herself with grace and confidence, even when the environment seemed to silently question her presence. Her Americano was placed on the counter, breaking her thoughts. "Thank you," she said, picking up the steaming cup and turning toward the seating area. She spotted a small table by the large bay window, its surface bathed in soft sunlight. Perfect, she thought. A quiet spot to read, with the warm sun at her back and a view of the bustling street outside. As she made her way to the table, she felt a few more eyes on her, glances from the other patrons, curious, perhaps even judgmental. But Emily wasn't here to be distracted by the perceptions of others. She placed her book on the table, pulling out the chair and sitting down, taking a moment to savor the peace she had sought out. The rich aroma of the coffee filled the air around her as she took her first sip, feeling the warmth spread through her body. The book she had been carrying, a leather-bound novel she had started weeks ago, was finally open in front of her. Emily smiled to herself, turning the first page and sinking into the story, her shoulders relaxing for what felt like the first time in months. Outside the window, pedestrians hurried by, going about their day, while inside she felt shielded from the rush of the world. But even as she tried to lose herself in the pages of her book, something felt off. It was the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the sensation that she was being watched. Emily glanced up from her novel, scanning the room. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place. The patrons were still quietly sipping their drinks, engaged in their own conversations or tasks. But then her eyes landed on him. Standing near the entrance, his arms crossed over his broad chest, was the cafe's security guard. He was tall, his build imposing, with a hard-set face that seemed to take his job far more seriously than the casual setting of the cafe would warrant. He wasn't looking around the room or observing the space as one might expect a guard to do. No, his eyes were locked directly on her. Emily returned his gaze for a second before lowering her eyes back to her book, trying to ignore the tension creeping up her spine. She had encountered people like him before, men who looked at her not with curiosity, but with a sense of superiority. The kind of men who felt the need to assert their control, to remind her that she didn't quite fit into the world they had carved out for themselves. She took another sip of her coffee, determined to brush it off, but the feeling didn't go away. Each time she glanced up, she caught him watching her, his gaze unwavering, almost calculating. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't friendly. And that's when she knew. Today would not be the peaceful escape she had hoped for. From across the room, Robert Mitchell watched Emily with growing suspicion. He had been a security guard at the Magnolia Caffe for 5 years, and in all that time he had developed an instinct for when something wasn't right. At least that's what he told himself. He prided himself on maintaining order, ensuring that the cafe's peaceful atmosphere was never disturbed. The Magnolia was a place for a certain kind of clientele, people who understood and appreciated its quiet, refined charm. Over the years, Robert had seen all types come and go, but he had learned to recognize those who belonged and those who didn't. It wasn't anything explicit, of course. There were no signs or rules about who could or couldn't sit in the cafe. But Robert had his own sense of what the cafe stood for, and he took it upon himself to enforce those unspoken standards. When Emily had walked in, something about her had caught his attention immediately. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, with a quiet confidence that he found unsettling. Or maybe it was because she was different from the regular patrons who frequented the cafe. The Magnolia was a space that catered to a predominantly white, upper-middle-class crowd. It wasn't a place where you often saw someone like her, a black woman, dressed well but not in a way that screamed affluence. Robert's gaze followed Emily as she ordered her coffee and sat by the window. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She looked too comfortable, too at ease in a place where she should have felt out of place. His hand twitched at his side, a sense of unease building in his chest. He had seen situations like this before, and in his experience, someone who didn't fit the profile of the cafe's usual patrons was often trouble. He told himself he was just doing his job, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. But deep down, Robert knew it wasn't about Emily's actions. It was about who she was and how she carried herself. She didn't belong here, not in his eyes, and he was going to make sure she knew it. Emily had just begun to settle into her book, allowing herself to be drawn into its familiar story, when she sensed a shift in the energy around her. She was no stranger to discomfort in spaces like this, but something about the air in the cafe felt different. She could feel it, a presence lingering, watching, waiting. Slowly, she looked up, her fingers pausing mid-page, only to find the security guard standing directly beside her table. Robert's imposing frame towered over her, his arms still crossed tightly across his chest. His face was stern, eyes sharp as they bore down on her. Emily blinked, momentarily confused, wondering what this man could possibly want from her. She hadn't done anything wrong. All she had done was walk into a cafe, order a coffee, and sit down. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification," Robert said, his voice flat, authoritative. Emily's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with surprise. "Is there a problem?" Robert's eyes remained fixed on her. "We have rules here," he said, his tone clipped, devoid of any warmth. "And I need to make sure you're not causing trouble." For a moment, Emily was taken aback. Causing trouble? What trouble? She had walked into the cafe like any other customer, ordered a drink, and quietly sat down to enjoy her book. There was nothing remotely suspicious about her actions. The only thing that seemed out of place was the guard's sudden and aggressive attention. "I'm just having a coffee," Emily said, trying to keep her voice measured despite the rising tension she felt within her. "I'm not sure why you're asking me for ID." Robert leaned in slightly, his towering presence casting a shadow over her table. His voice lowered, but the harshness in it remained. "I asked for your ID. Either show it, or I'll have to ask you to leave." The words hit Emily like a slap in the face. She could feel the weight of the other patron's eyes on her, watching the confrontation unfold. Whispers began to ripple across the room. Some patrons looked on in curiosity, while others glanced away, uncomfortable with what was happening, but unwilling to intervene. Emily's heartbeat quickened, but she remained composed. This wasn't about any rule she had broken. It wasn't about her actions. This was about who she was. The realization settled over her like a cold shroud. She was being targeted because she didn't fit the profile of the cafe's usual clientele, because she was a black woman in a predominantly white space. "I don't see why I need to show you my ID," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." Robert's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. Either show me your ID, or I'll have to escort you out." The tension in the cafe grew thicker. Emily could feel the patrons' silent judgment, their stares burning into her. She could also sense the silent hope from some of them that she would simply comply, avoid making a scene, and leave quietly. But Emily had spent too many years in spaces like this, too many years fighting for the rights of others, to back down now. Slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out her ID. Her hands were steady as she handed it to Robert, but beneath the calm exterior, her blood boiled. This wasn't about policy. This was about power. It was about control. And Robert was using his position to exert both over her. Robert barely glanced at the ID before tossing it back onto the table. He didn't even seem to care about her name or who she was. His eyes flicked over her outfit, his gaze lingering on the white blouse she wore. "We have a dress code here," Robert said, his tone shifting slightly, as if he had found something new to hold against her. "And your blouse is too revealing. You're going to have to leave." Emily's jaw tightened. She looked down at her blouse, a perfectly professional, modest garment that was neither inappropriate nor revealing in any way. Her anger flared, but she forced herself to remain calm. "There's nothing inappropriate about what I'm wearing," she said, her voice cold. "This isn't about a dress code." Robert smirked, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying this. Emily could see it, the way he reveled in his position of authority, the way he had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing. But Emily wasn't going to let him push her around. "Stand up," Robert ordered, his voice growing louder, more commanding. "I need to see for myself." Emily felt her pulse quicken. She could feel the stares of everyone in the cafe intensify as the situation escalated. She didn't want to make a scene, but she also wasn't going to be bullied into submission. Slowly she stood, her eyes never leaving Robert's, refusing to let him intimidate her. But as soon as she was on her feet, Robert reached out, his hand grabbing the front of her blouse as if to inspect it. The audacity of the gesture stunned Emily into silence for a moment. And then, to her horror, Robert's hand moved toward the top button of her blouse. "Stop!" Emily's voice rang out, sharp and clear. But it was too late. Robert had already begun unbuttoning her blouse, exposing the top of her chest. Gasps filled the cafe. Patrons looked on in shock, some with their phones out, recording the scene. Yet despite the horror of what was unfolding, no one moved to intervene. Emily felt a surge of humiliation and anger rise within her. This man had crossed a line. He had violated her personal space, her dignity, and her humanity. And he had done it in full view of everyone, without a second thought. Instinctively, Emily's hands shot up to stop him, her fingers grasping the fabric of her blouse as she pulled away from his grasp. Her breath was shaky, her heart racing. But she didn't back down. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. For a moment, the cafe was utterly still, the only sounds being the distant clinking of cups and the soft murmur of voices from those outside the building. But inside, the air was thick with tension, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Emily stood her ground, her blouse clutched tightly in her hands, her chest heaving with indignation. She locked eyes with Robert, her fury barely contained beneath her calm demeanor. But even as she stared him down, the humiliation burned inside her. She had come here for a peaceful afternoon, and instead, she was being publicly shamed. The patrons in the cafe remained passive. No one spoke. No one stood up. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none of them made a move to intervene. Some of them were recording the incident on their phones, capturing every humiliating moment as though it were some kind of spectacle to be consumed later. Emily's stomach churned at the thought. It was at that moment that Emily heard a voice cut through the silence, a woman's voice trembling with disgust. "I'm calling the police," the woman said, standing from her seat near the back of the cafe. She held her phone to her ear, her expression one of outrage. "This is unacceptable. I'm calling 911. The words sent a ripple through the cafe. Robert's face paled slightly, his confidence faltering as he realized that the situation was no longer under his control. The tension in the room shifted, and for the first time, Robert seemed to hesitate. He took a step back, his hand dropping from Emily's blouse as he tried to regain his composure. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Minutes later, the wail of approaching sirens broke the uneasy silence of the cafe. The patrons shifted in their seats, some still watching intently, others looking away, pretending not to be part of the unfolding drama. Emily remained standing, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to compose herself. She was angry, humiliated, but above all determined not to let this man get away with what he had done. The door to the cafe swung open, and two police officers, Officer Ryan Taylor and Officer Jack Anderson, strode in. Both were tall, broad-shouldered men in their 40s, with the confident gait of seasoned law enforcement. Their eyes swept the room, quickly assessing the situation. Robert stood near Emily, arms now crossed defensively, while she stood stiffly, trying to hold on to her composure. Without a word, the officers walked straight over to Robert, ignoring Emily entirely. "What's going on here?" Officer Taylor asked, his voice stern and authoritative, his gaze fixed on Robert. Robert straightened up, his earlier smugness returning. "She wasn't following the dress code," he said, motioning toward Emily. "I asked her to leave and she refused. She was causing a disturbance." Emily's mouth fell open in disbelief. A disturbance? He had humiliated her in front of everyone, and now he was trying to paint her as the problem? Her frustration boiled over, but before she could speak, Officer Anderson turned to her. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step outside," he said, his tone flat and dismissive. "You've caused enough of a disturbance here." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. The room around her seemed to tilt for a moment as she processed what was happening. The officers had immediately sided with Robert without even hearing her side of the story. She, the victim in this situation, was being treated like the problem. It was as if her presence, her very existence, was enough to warrant suspicion and blame. She opened her mouth to protest, but Officer Anderson's hand was already on his belt, his posture stiff and ready to escalate the situation if necessary. "I've caused a disturbance?" Emily repeated, her voice shaking with anger. "You haven't even asked me what happened." "We have his statement," Officer Taylor said, nodding toward Robert. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Emily's heart raced, her mind spinning with a mix of rage and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. How could they not see what had really taken place? How could they ignore her, dismiss her, simply because Robert wore a uniform and she didn't? But then something clicked inside her, a moment of clarity that cut through the fog of anger and hurt. She wasn't just Emily Davis, the cafe patron who had been harassed. She was Emily Davis, a civil rights attorney who had spent her career fighting for justice and standing up against the very kind of injustice she was now facing. With steady hands, Emily reached into her purse and pulled out her business card, holding it out for the officers to see. "My name is Emily Davis," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I'm a civil rights attorney, and I know exactly what my rights are." The cafe fell into an almost deafening silence, as if everyone inside had collectively stopped breathing. Officer Taylor hesitated for a moment, his hand reaching out to take the card from Emily's steady grasp. The realization of who they were dealing with settled over him like a lead weight. This wasn't just a typical confrontation. Emily Davis wasn't someone they could easily dismiss or push around. She was a civil rights attorney, and she knew the law far better than they did. Officer Anderson's eyes darted between Emily and Robert, his earlier confidence faltering. He had walked into the cafe expecting to resolve a simple situation, a misunderstanding at best. But now he realized he had miscalculated, badly. Emily, sensing the shift in their demeanor, didn't wait for them to speak. She seized the moment. "What happened here today," Emily began, her voice calm but charged with conviction, "is not just an act of harassment. It's a blatant abuse of power, fueled by prejudice. This man," she pointed to Robert, "undressed me in front of everyone in this cafe. He humiliated me, violated my personal space, and disrespected me. And when you walked in, you immediately took his side without so much as asking for my side of the story." Officer Taylor opened his mouth to speak, but Emily wasn't finished. "You assumed," Emily continued, her voice rising slightly, "that I was in the wrong simply because I don't look like the usual customers who come in here. You didn't stop to consider that I was the victim of his actions. You just accepted his word because he's wearing a uniform." Her words hung in the air, heavy and damning. The cafe patrons, who had earlier been passive observers to Emily's humiliation, were now murmuring amongst themselves. The weight of what had happened was finally starting to sink in. They had witnessed an injustice, and now Emily was holding everyone accountable for their role in it. Robert, who had stood tall and arrogant just moments before, now looked visibly uncomfortable. His bravado had cracked, and he shifted uneasily from one foot to the other. The smug smile that had once played at the corners of his mouth was long gone, replaced by a tight frown. He hadn't expected this outcome. He had thought that Emily would be just another black woman he could push out of the cafe without any consequences. But now, as Emily stood before him, unwavering and resolute, he realized that he had underestimated her. Badly. Officer Anderson, who had been silent throughout Emily's speech, finally spoke, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "Ma'am, we didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" Emily cut him off, her tone sharp. "You didn't mean to assume I was in the wrong because of the color of my skin? You didn't mean to ignore the fact that this man violated my rights in front of everyone?" The cafe had grown even quieter, the air thick with tension. The patrons who had remained silent were now forced to reckon with what they had witnessed. Some of them had recorded the incident on their phones. Others had whispered to each other, but none of them had spoken up to her when it mattered. Robert, who had been so confident in his authority, now stood dumbfounded, his eyes cast downward, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. The gravity of the situation had finally dawned on him. Emily took a step closer to the officers, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "You didn't even bother to ask for my side of the story," she said, her voice low but commanding. "You walked in here, saw a black woman, and immediately assumed I was the problem. That's not just ignorance, it's bias. It's systemic. And it's exactly what I spend my career fighting against." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence completely eroded by the force of her words. They had walked into the cafe expecting to resolve a simple altercation, but now they were being confronted by a lawyer who knew the law better than they did, a woman who wouldn't back down. One of the officers stammered, "We apologize, ma'am. We didn't mean—" "It's not just about an apology," Emily said, cutting him off again. "It's about recognizing that this kind of behavior, this kind of bias, happens every day. And unless we hold people accountable, it will continue." The murmurs in the cafe grew louder. Emily could see the weight of her words beginning to settle on the patrons as well. Some of them exchanged guilty glances. Others simply stared at their phones, uncomfortable with their own silence during the incident. Robert, who had been silent for most of the confrontation, finally spoke, though his voice was low and filled with regret. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled, his eyes still cast downward. "No," Emily said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You weren't doing your job. You were abusing your position of authority to target someone who didn't fit your idea of who belongs here. You assumed without any evidence that I was causing trouble simply because I'm black." Robert swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't mean to," he said weakly. Emily's eyes flashed with controlled anger. It's easy to say you didn't mean to, she said, her voice now softer but still edged with steel. But the damage is done. You humiliated me. You violated my dignity, and you reinforced a system of inequality that harms people of color every single day. Robert's face flushed with embarrassment. His earlier arrogance had completely dissolved, leaving only a man who had come to realize the severity of his actions far too late. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke again, barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Emily's gaze softened slightly, but her resolve remained. I hope you mean that, she said, because your actions today affected more than just me. They sent a message to everyone in this cafe that people like me don't belong here, that we need to be policed, monitored, and controlled just for existing in spaces like this. Robert couldn't meet her eyes. His earlier sense of superiority had crumbled completely, replaced by the unmistakable look of someone who knew they had crossed a line, but didn't know how to make it right. The officers, too, looked visibly uncomfortable. The business card in Officer Taylor's hand seemed to burn as though its very presence demanded accountability. Ma'am, we apologize, Officer Taylor said again, his voice quieter now. We made a mistake. Emily regarded him for a moment, her expression unreadable. It's not just about a mistake, she said. It's about recognizing the patterns that lead to these kinds of mistakes. It's about understanding that every time you walk into a situation like this, you need to ask yourself, am I being fair? Am I treating this person with the respect they deserve, regardless of how they look? The officers nodded, their faces filled with a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. They had been called in to resolve a situation, but they had made it worse by failing to recognize their own biases. The cafe, once a bustling hub of conversation and clinking cups, was now enveloped in a tense silence. The patrons, who had been mere spectators to the unfolding drama, were now witnesses to something far more profound, both for Robert and for themselves. The weight of Emily's words lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. A woman sitting near the back of the cafe, a middle-aged customer who had been quietly watching the confrontation, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly but filled with remorse. I'm sorry, she said, standing from her seat. I should have said something earlier. I should have spoken up when I saw what was happening. Her words seemed to break the dam of silence that had held the room captive. A few other patrons murmured their agreement, their eyes downcast in shame. They had watched, they had recorded, but none of them had intervened when it mattered. Now they were left to reckon with their own inaction. Emily turned to face them, her expression softening just a little. It's not just about this moment, she said, her voice carrying across the room. It's about recognizing that moments like this happen every day. And it's about making the decision to stand up when you see injustice, no matter how small it might seem. The woman nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Others in the cafe shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at their phones or down at their coffee cups, unwilling to meet Emily's gaze. But the message had been received. The weight of their complicity, their silence in the face of injustice, had become impossible to ignore. The incident at Magnolia Café did not end when Emily walked out that day. By the time she had returned home, videos of the altercation had already begun to circulate on social media. The footage, captured by multiple patrons, showed the entire humiliating scene. Robert grabbing at her blouse, unbuttoning it without her consent, and the police officers dismissing her side of the story without a second thought. The public outrage was immediate and fierce. The hashtag number Justice for Emily began trending within hours, with people across the country expressing their shock and anger at the blatant racial profiling and harassment she had endured. Civil rights organizations picked up the story, demanding justice not only for Emily, but for all people of color who had experienced similar forms of discrimination. Emily, though reluctant to be thrust into the spotlight, knew that this moment was bigger than herself. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity, she was fighting for systemic change. And so, she filed a lawsuit against Magnolia Café, not for financial compensation, but to force a change in their policies. The lawsuit became a national news story. Media outlets covered the case extensively, interviewing Emily about her experience and the broader issues of racial profiling and discrimination in public spaces. Civil rights leaders rallied behind her, using the case to push for reforms in how businesses handled issues of bias and misconduct. Months later, the courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and members of the community. Emily sat in front of her lawyer beside her, ready to present her case. Across the aisle, the cafe's management and legal team sat stiffly, their faces drawn with tension. The trial had garnered national attention, not only because of the viral video, but because of the larger implications it held for racial equality in public spaces. Emily's legal team argued that the incident at Magnolia Caffe was not just an isolated event. It was part of a broader pattern of discrimination against people of color. They presented evidence of similar incidents in other establishments across the country, showing how deeply ingrained these biases were. The defense, for their part, tried to argue that Robert had simply been enforcing the cafe's policies. But it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that this wasn't about a dress code or any legitimate rule. It was about power, about control, and about systemic racism that allowed someone like Robert to believe he could get away with humiliating Emily without consequence. In the end, the court ruled in Emily's favor. The cafe was ordered to pay damages, but more importantly, they were required to implement new policies that would prevent racial profiling and discrimination in the future. Employees, including security personnel, would be required to undergo bias training, and the cafe would be monitored to ensure compliance with anti-discrimination laws. It was a victory not just for Emily, but for all people of color who had faced similar treatment in public spaces. And while the fight for equality was far from over, this case had set a new precedent. Months after the trial, Emily returned to Magnolia Caffe, not as a patron, but as a guest speaker. The cafe's new management had reached out to her, asking if she would speak at a community forum they were hosting. The purpose of the forum was to address issues of racial bias and discrimination, and they wanted her to be the keynote speaker. Emily had agreed, though it wasn't easy for her to return to the place where she had been so deeply humiliated. But she knew that this moment was about more than her own discomfort. It was about continuing the fight for justice and equality. The cafe was packed with people from all walks of life: customers, activists, community leaders, and even some of the patrons who had been there the day of the incident. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, a sense of anticipation filling the air as people waited for Emily to speak. She stood at the front of the room, her heart pounding in her chest, but her resolve as strong as ever. "What happened here that day," she began, her voice steady, "wasn't just about one person's actions. It was about a system that allows people of color to be treated as though they don't belong in spaces like this. It's about the silent complicity of those who watch and do nothing." Her eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of those who had witnessed the incident. Some looked back at her with guilt, others with determination to do better. "But we have a choice," Emily continued. "We can continue to perpetuate these cycles of discrimination, or we can choose to stand up and say no more. We can choose to create spaces where everyone, regardless of their race or background, feels welcome and respected." The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't the tense, uncomfortable silence of complicity. It was the silence of people listening, of people understanding, of people ready to change. As Emily finished her speech and stepped down from the podium, she knew that the fight for equality was far from over. But she also knew that she had made a difference. And for the first time since that fateful day in the cafe, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. When Emily left the cafe that day, she had expected the ordeal to haunt her, lingering like a bitter taste in her mouth. But what she hadn't anticipated was the sheer force with which the world would respond. The moment the video of the incident went viral, it was as if a dam had broken. People from all walks of life, from all across the country, took to social media to express their outrage and support for her. The hashtag #Justice for Emily was trending within hours, accompanied by waves of public outcry over racial profiling and abuse of power. The video footage, filmed by multiple patrons in the cafe, was being shared across platforms like wildfire. Comments poured in, many of them expressing shock and anger at what had transpired. But there were also messages from people who had experienced similar injustices, thanking Emily for standing up and giving them a voice. For Emily, the sudden attention was overwhelming. She had fought for justice in courtrooms her entire career, but now she was the center of a national conversation about systemic racism and discrimination in public spaces. Her phone rang nonstop with interview requests, her email inbox flooded with messages of support, and her social media account swelled with followers who looked to her for guidance and leadership in this moment of reckoning. But for every message of support, there were also messages of hate, vicious, cruel comments from people who refused to acknowledge the reality of what had happened to her. Some accused her of exaggerating the situation, of playing the race card, while others hurled racial slurs at her, attempting to diminish her humanity. These messages were a stark reminder that while many were waking up to the pervasive issue of racial injustice, there were still those who clung tightly to their prejudices. Emily knew that this was not just about her anymore. She had become a symbol, and with that came responsibility. She wasn't fighting only for her own dignity. She was fighting for the dignity of every person who had been targeted because of their race. This was a battle she hadn't asked for, but it was one she was willing to fight. As the days passed, public pressure mounted on Magnolia Caffe. People began organizing protests outside the establishment, demanding accountability and change. The cafe's management, already facing a PR nightmare, issued a public statement apologizing for the incident. But for many, the apology was too little, too late. The backlash against Magnolia Caffe wasn't limited to social media. Within days of the incident going viral, local news stations picked up the story, turning it into a national headline. Protesters gathered outside the cafe, holding signs that read, "No justice, no peace, and end racial profiling now." The once popular establishment had become a flashpoint in the broader conversation about racial discrimination in America. The cafe's regular patrons, many of whom had been oblivious to the underlying tensions, were now forced to confront the reality of the place they had frequented for years. Some swore they would never return, disgusted by what they had seen. Others tried to defend the cafe, claiming that the incident was an isolated event, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But the footage didn't lie, and neither did the testimonies of those who had been there that day. The cafe's management, desperate to contain the fallout, scrambled to implement damage control. They suspended Robert from his position as security guard and promised to review their internal policies to prevent future incidents of discrimination. But the public wasn't satisfied with the suspension. They wanted real change, accountability, not just for Robert, but for the entire establishment that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Meanwhile, Emily's lawsuit against the cafe was gaining traction. Civil rights organizations, already rallying behind her, offered their support in the legal battle ahead. The case was no longer just about one incident. It had become a symbol of the larger fight against systemic racism in public spaces. As the lawsuit progressed, Emily found herself becoming a public figure in ways she had never anticipated. She was invited to speak at panels and forums, to give interviews on national television, and to lend her voice to the growing movement for justice. But with every public appearance, she felt the weight of expectation on her shoulders. People looked at her not just as a victim, but as a leader, someone who could help guide the country toward a better future. In the weeks following the incident, Emily found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn her life had taken. The fight for justice had always been a part of who she was, but this fight felt different. It was more personal, more immediate, and more visible than any courtroom battle she had ever fought. She thought often of the people who had watched the incident unfold in the cafe, the silent patrons who had recorded the confrontation but done nothing to intervene. She wondered about their silence, about the complicity of those who choose not to act when they witness injustice. But she also thought of the woman who had called the police, the woman whose voice had broken the silence and sparked the chain of events that followed. It was a reminder that change didn't come from silence. It came from speaking out, from standing up when it mattered most. One afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table reviewing the latest developments in her case, Emily received an unexpected phone call. It was from Robert. He sounded different, humbled perhaps, or maybe just defeated. He asked if he could meet with her, to apologize in person, to explain himself. Emily hesitated, unsure of whether she wanted to face him again. But something inside her told her that this conversation, difficult as it might be, was necessary. Emily agreed to meet Robert at a neutral location, a quiet park near her home. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that she couldn't move forward without hearing him out. It wasn't about forgiving him, but about understanding how someone could have behaved the way he had. When she arrived, she saw Robert sitting on a bench, his posture slouched, his face drawn with regret. He looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of his actions had physically diminished him. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Robert said, his voice quiet, almost shaky. Emily nodded, sitting down on the bench beside him but keeping a few feet of distance between them. "Why did you want to meet?" she asked, her tone neutral, though she could feel the tension in her body. Robert sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know how to explain it," he said. "I've been thinking about what happened, about what I did. I've been thinking a lot about why I did it." He paused, glancing down at his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. "I'm not going to make excuses," he continued. "What I did was wrong. I crossed a line. No, I crossed many lines, and I've spent every day since then wondering how I could have been so blind." Emily listened in silence, watching him closely, waiting to see if he was truly remorseful or just trying to ease his own guilt. "I've worked security for years," Robert said, his voice cracking slightly, "and I thought I knew what it meant to protect a place, to keep order. But somewhere along the way, I started thinking that meant controlling people, deciding who belonged and who didn't. I judged you the second you walked in, without even realizing it. I thought I was doing my job, but I wasn't. I was letting my biases, my ignorance dictate my actions." He looked up at Emily then, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that's not enough, but I needed to say it. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that I've been trying to understand how I can do better." Emily took a deep breath, considering his words. She had spent her life fighting for people to recognize their biases, to confront the ways in which prejudice shaped their actions. And now here was Robert, finally acknowledging his role in that system, finally understanding the harm he had caused. "I appreciate you reaching out," Emily said slowly, her voice measured. "But it's not just about you. What happened that day wasn't just about one person's actions. It's about a system that allows people like you to act with impunity, to humiliate people like me without fear of consequences. It's about the way we're all conditioned to see certain people as less deserving of respect." Robert nodded, his eyes filled with the weight of her words. "I understand that now," he said, "and I'm committed to changing. I've already started attending bias training sessions, and I'm trying to educate myself. But I know it's not enough. I know I have a long way to go." Emily regarded him for a moment longer before standing up. "Change isn't easy," she said. "It takes time and it takes work. But I hope you're serious about doing that work." Robert nodded solemnly. "I am," he said. "I promise." Months after the lawsuit had been settled, Magnolia Caffe reopened under new management. The previous owners, disgraced by the scandal and facing ongoing pressure from the public, had decided to sell the business to a group of local entrepreneurs. These new owners had a vision of inclusivity, where the cafe would become a space welcoming to all, regardless of background, race, or class. Emily had heard about the changes from news articles and social media, but she hadn't been back since the incident. Part of her wanted to avoid the place altogether, a reminder of the humiliation and anger she had felt that day. But when the new owners invited her to attend the cafe's reopening event, she felt compelled to go. On the day of the reopening, Emily stood outside the cafe, looking up at the familiar green sign with its elegant white lettering. But something was different this time. There was no tension in the air, no unspoken barrier between her and the space she was about to enter. Inside, the cafe buzzed with excitement. A mix of people, young, old, black, white, Asian, Latinx, milled about, chatting happily, sipping their coffee, and enjoying the new atmosphere. Emily walked in, feeling a sense of cautious optimism. The changes were immediately noticeable. The staff was more diverse, the decor more vibrant, and the walls featured artwork from local artists of different cultural backgrounds. A large banner hung near the counter that read, "All are welcome here," in bold letters, a stark contrast to the silent exclusivity that had once defined the space. As Emily moved through the cafe, she was greeted by smiles and nods, not the wary glances she had received months ago. It was as if the energy of the place had shifted, transformed by the collective efforts of the community and the lessons learned from the incident. The new owners, a team of 3 women, 2 of them women of color, approached Emily with warm smiles. Carmen, the leader of the group, extended her hand. "Thank you for coming, Emily," she said. "We couldn't have done this without you." Emily shook her hand, humbled by the gesture. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was the entire community that demanded change." Carmen nodded. "That's true. But you were the catalyst. You stood up when others wouldn't. You reminded us all that we can't stay silent in the face of injustice." As they talked, Emily could see that the cafe had become a symbol of progress, a place that had taken its painful past and turned it into something hopeful. The changes weren't just superficial. The cafe's new policies on inclusivity, the bias training for staff, and the open forums they now hosted for the community were signs of real, lasting transformation. For the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of closure. The fight for justice was far from over. But today, standing in the middle of a space that had once made her feel unwelcome, she could see the tangible results of her efforts and the efforts of those who had supported her. In the weeks that followed, Emily continued her work as a civil rights attorney with renewed energy. The Magnolia Cafe incident had brought her national attention, but it had also reminded her of the importance of grassroots action, of standing up, not just in courtrooms, but in everyday spaces where injustice could easily be overlooked. She was invited to speak at universities, community centers, and public forums, sharing her story and the lessons learned from her battle with Magnolia Cafe. Her message was clear. Change starts with each of us, in the moments when we choose to speak out instead of staying silent. It starts in the places where we spend our time, in cafes, in schools, in workplaces where we must hold each other accountable and demand that everyone be treated with respect and dignity. One evening, after a particularly moving panel discussion at a local university, Emily received an unexpected message. It was from the woman who had called 911 the day of the incident. The message was simple but heartfelt. "Thank you for standing up that day. You made me realize that we all have a role to play in fighting injustice, no matter how small it might seem at the time." Emily smiled as she read the message, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She had made a difference not just for herself, but for the people who had watched her stand on her ground, for the people who had seen the power of one voice speaking truth to power. As the months passed, Emily found herself reflecting on the journey she had been on since that fateful day at the cafe. It had been a long, difficult road, filled with moments of doubt, anger, and frustration. But it had also been a journey of growth, of healing, and of triumph. Her lawsuit had set a new precedent, not just for her, but for the countless people who had been victims of racial profiling and discrimination in public spaces. The changes at Magnolia Cafe were just one example of what could happen when people came together to demand accountability. But Emily knew that the fight for justice was ongoing. She had seen the darker side of humanity in the hate-filled messages she had received, in the people who had refused to acknowledge the reality of what had happened to her. She had also seen the best of humanity in the outpouring of support, in the people who had stood with her, and in the cafe that had transformed into a beacon of inclusivity. Emily wasn't done. There were more battles to fight, more voices to amplify, more systems to challenge. But for today, she allowed herself a moment of peace. She had stood up, she had spoken out, and she had made a difference. And she knew that, no matter what came next, she would continue to fight for a world where dignity, respect, and justice weren't just ideals, but realities for everyone. Months after the cafe's reopening, Emily attended a special event at Magnolia, now celebrated for its transformation into an inclusive space. As she listened to Carmen's speech, surrounded by a vibrant community that had embraced change, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The journey had been long, but it had led to real, lasting progress. As the event came to a close and the crowd dispersed, Emily stepped forward to say a few words. The room quieted as she approached the microphone. Tonight isn't just a celebration of an award, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It's a reminder of what's possible when we stand up against injustice, when we demand that everyone be treated with dignity and respect. But the fight doesn't end here. There are more spaces to transform, more voices to amplify, and more systems to challenge. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. We have the power to create change, but only if we keep pushing, keep learning, and keep speaking up. As she looked around the room, she smiled. And one way to stay connected, to keep the conversation going, is to join a community that believes in this mission. So if you want to continue supporting stories of change, of transformation, and of standing up for what's right, subscribe to our channel. Together, we can make sure that voices like mine and voices like yours are heard. She gestured toward the cameras that were live streaming the event, a nod to the digital world that had played such a huge part in her journey. Hit that subscribe button, share this message with others, and let's keep building a world where dignity, respect, and justice are not just ideals, but realities. The crowd erupted into applause, and as Emily stepped back from the microphone, she felt the warmth of their support. The fight would continue, but now she knew she wasn't alone. And with every new subscriber, every new voice added to the conversation, the movement would grow stronger.